Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Am I coming across okay in audio and you can see my screen?
Yep,
Uh,
sounds great.
Very good. Just a few things I wanted to mention up front is that I welcome questions and comments during the presentation. I don't see any reason to keep those to the end. So I'm not sure how we can do that, if they can put that into the chat or otherwise let us know if there's something that I want to discuss. I look forward to that. I would really like to have as much feedback because usually in normal times I'm on in the room and I can see the expressions on people's faces, whether they're getting bored or agreeing or getting mad at me. So if we can replace that, instant feedback when I'm in the room with some comments or questions, that'd probably be better for everybody.
I'll
Uh,
monitor for questions and pipe in if one's posted.
Thank you. So this morning, I would like to discuss some of the research I've been doing in Kansas on ag technology across generations. This is my second time at the Mid Atlantic Crop Management School. It's been several years since I was here last time. I believe I was with the University of Arkansas, which was at least 8 years ago. My contact information is on the cover slide here. Not just today, but in the future, if you want to follow me on Twitter or Parlor, both are at the same handle, Space Plowboy. I tweet out about farm management in general, and most of my research and social media output revolves around ag technology, farm data, and every time I have a new university publication available, I let the world know about it there. And also, my email address is here too for uh, more in depth correspondence. And I am the cropping systems economist and associate professor at Kansas State University in the Department of Agriculture Economics. 80% of my effort is in extension and outreach, and 20% in applied research. And I'm going to present some of my applied research um, this morning. So I left in the description mainly, probably more for my own guidance than for you, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time on differences between generations. We know that younger people tend to desire to have more technology than older people, but let's wanted to really look at that from a financial perspective in what we've observed in Kansas, and I hope you feel that this is appropriate uh, for where you are farming and where you are providing your crop consulting services and so forth. And that being said, at times I'm going to speak to farmers, and at times I'm going to speak directly to crop consultants, and other times I'll speak directly to other service providers. So I'm hoping, regardless of your um, standing, your profession, you'll get something useful out of our discussion today. As we tread through some of this, I want to remind you of a basic premise in economics. If you've sat in a class in Economics 101, you talk about this concept. Do the benefits outweigh the cost of a decision? And this is something I will remind you of as we'll go through the presentation today. And one of the things I'm going to mention is FOMO. A lot of times in abbreviations like this, we'll see this, especially used by younger generations who are relying upon text messaging and other types of abbreviated um, conversation. FOMO means the fear of missing out. And the reason I bring this up right now is I see a lot of people making decisions based upon their fear of missing out on something. If I was to have a pop quiz, it would be okay. So you had the benefits on one side of the equation and cost on the other side of the equation, or in this case, on the scales. Where does FOMO go? And it's a trick question. It doesn't go anywhere on here. The fear of missing out should not lead a person into making a business decision. So this is some of the data that I have really been keeping me busy the last few years. In Kansas, there is the Kansas Farm Management Association, KFMA, and you'll see this little symbol from time to time that on some of my slides. The KFMA has been around for a very long time, a century, and for the last 40 something years, the data from KFMA is electronic, and it's all about financial record keeping, production yields, and acreage across Kansas farms. Today, we have about 2,000 farms who are members, and they collectively provide data to the university for agriculture economists to do research, and a lot of the academic papers that we publish come from this data set. When I arrived in Kansas 5 years ago, we started asking another question every year. We would ask, farmer, what technologies do you use on your farm, and when did you adopt those technologies? And here are the 8 most interesting technologies on that list. In their graph since 1990, so on the x-axis is time, 1990 up to 2018, I believe, was the most recent data that I'm displaying here. And on the y-axis is percentage of farms, not acreage. This is percentage of farms. And so far, we have 656 farms that have reported their use or non-use of technology. Again, if were to have a pop quiz, I would ask you, what is the first word and the name of the most adopted technologies today? It will be this light blue and a dark blue line. If we look over here, we see automated guidance and automated section control. So therefore, the most adopted technologies in Kansas, and I suspect across the United States, the first word in their name is automated. That is not a coincidence. There's a reason that farmers, are adopting technologies that are automated. It's to remove some of the requirements of human interaction. And more to the point, I'm going to show the next slide will show when these technologies were commercialized. Automated guidance and automated section control are relatively new compared to many of these other technologies that are all about data. Yield monitor has been around for a very long time. And just for your note, GNSS is just another way of saying GPS. It's more of a generic term for GPS. So yield monitor with a GPS on it's been around since GPS became available for civilian uses. So a lot longer than automated technologies. One of the things I'll speak about today in more detail is variable rate fertility and seeding, and how this differs across generations. So as we're looking at this graph, we could literally spend hours. We spend all day just talking about things that we notice in this graph. And I'm sure that you're noticing things as well. And if you see anything you want to discuss more, have at it and let me know. But one of the things that people usually come to the conclusion, hopefully, is that, wow, not all farmers have all technologies. And I think that's a really good takeaway message, because a lot of the farms I'm working with come to me and say, Griffin, I feel like I'm behind. All the other farmers have all these technologies and I don't. And my response is, well, just wait a minute. Not everybody has everything today. And more to the point, I would argue that not all farmers should have all technologies. And many of these technologies, such as variable rate fertility, for instance, not only depends on where, the field, the crop, the soil fertility levels. It depends a whole lot on the who. And the who could be the farmer, the crop consultant, or other advisors. But someone within arm's length of that farm needs to have ample human capital to allocate to dealing with technology, dealing with mounds of data, dealing with these things that are providing a lot of information that's requiring more management effort. So it's not just someone locally needs to have that level of interest and ability to allocate human effort to make some of these technologies work. They're not quite automated yet, but hopefully they will be in the future. So I'll return to this towards the end as well. It's one of the comments I make that isn't usually well received because it's not just a product that we're concerned that works some places sometimes. It also depends on the person. Are there any comments so far, Sydney?
Not so far.
So I promised that the next graph would be kind of a timeline showing some of these technologies and when they were commercialized. If you notice, the most recently commercialized technologies were in 2016, which is about 15 years ago. Of course, there's other technologies that are coming out, especially revolving around farm data platforms. But the idea here is that these were the major technologies that were very different than anything that came before. Yield monitors, soil sampling. We have these back in the early 1990s, basically when GPS became available for civilian use. Automated guidance in the late 1990s, maybe right at 2000. This next, well, I want to make one more point about commercial availability. I started doing this applied research, and it became kind of obvious to me that some of these technologies have been around a lot longer, but they weren't available. Just because a yield monitor existed in some place in the world doesn't mean it was available on every dealership, such that farmers could have readily access to it. So we had to define what it meant to be commercially available, and we're still kind of playing with these terms and these dates. So this is, I left the timeline down here on the left-hand corner. This is what we call a violin plot. They're kind of messy, but I think they're kind of fun to look at. So this is showing when farmers in Kansas adopted each of these technologies. And we're calling it duration, but all that means is in years. 0 is the year that the technology was commercially available. So each of these has a different commercialization date. So, but they all line up on 0. So real rate fertility looks like really long, and the width of the plot means more people started adopting it. When it was narrow, very few people. The purple dot is median, the 50th percentile. Precision soil sampling, somewhat similar, a little bit fatter though at the end in yield monitors. But look at the guidance technology, starting with light bar, automated section control, and automated guidance. Automated section control hasn't been out readily available as long as the others, so it doesn't come out to as far to the right, but it start off wider than the other technologies. Just to give you a background of how farmers in Kansas are adopting ag technology, and one more before we kind of get into more interesting generational attributes is, well, how many technologies does a typical farmer have? And this is what we're seeing with another side study, 463 farms. So on the x-axis is the number of technologies on a farm. And I'm not saying that these are any specific technologies, but they're just the total number of technologies. And if it's 1 or 2 or 3, I think we can kind of guess what they are, but we don't know for sure. And on the y-axis is the total number of farms. So, pop quiz. How many technologies is the most typical for Kansas farms to have? Well, the tallest bar is this one, so it's 3. So farms in Kansas that I'm evaluating, the most commonly bundled technologies is 3 total. Okay. What's the second most common? Well, the second highest bar is this one, 0. No technology. So that's the second most common, is having no technologies on the farm. It kind of goes back to the point that not everybody has all technologies. And the third highest bar is 5. So it jumps out here. and then 4, and then 2, and then, well, I guess 1, and then 2, and then very few farms have all 8 of those I showed on the previous graph.
Terry, we do have a question. You may have already answered it. It looks like the question is, it looks like automated guidance use is decreasing. Is that correct? And if so, ideas as to why?
Well, all of these technologies are getting flatter. The one that has sort of plateaued is the red one, which is light bar, and it's been replaced by automated guidance. So the reason that these have plateaued in um, 2015 in the Midwest, well, what happened with commodity prices? People kind of stopped buying equipment, and many of these technologies are today aren't ones that you would have to go buy and then install on equipment. They come from the manufacturer already installed. But there for a while, many farms delayed equipment purchases. So what I think we're seeing here with these flat spots temporarily is just low commodity prices keeping farmers from buying equipment. Light bar, it has plateaued, but I believe that this has been farmers have upgraded to automated guidance here in light blue, the red, and many of the farms still keep them. So they're on the farm, may not be on the newest tractor, but maybe on, let's say, a sprayer or something else. They're still on the farm, but just not as readily used. Does that address the comment? We've got, I think, time to discuss that in more detail if necessary.
Yes, thank you.
Now we could spend all day on that graph, and so the next graph is some data from USDA, and it's getting quite old now. Farmers, you're familiar with the ARMS survey that USDA sends to you every year. It's the Ag Resource Management Survey, and each year is a focus on a different crop. And this particular data set is from 2002 to 2004, 5. And those years, soybean, cotton, wheat, barley, and corn were the focus. And back then, the USDA was asking this question was, farmer, if you have a yield monitor, how do you use it? And the percentages are over here on the x-axis, and the list of drop-down options were, I think the farmer could have checked one or more boxes of these predefined uses of yield monitors. The one I find most interesting is this one. The most common use of yield monitor in corn and soybean was to monitor moisture, which makes some sense from a harvest logistics perspective. And documenting yields was, sure, that's why we have yield monitor. But the third highest use of yield monitor, even back then, nearly 20 years ago, was to conduct field experiments. And this is where I spend a lot of my applied research area in trying to develop techniques for better management, best management practices of yield monitor data, verbal rate data, and so forth, to conduct on-farm experimentation so farmers could have a better insight into which products should be invested in for the next year on many thousands of acres, and from what we learned from this 10-acre experiment. So I wanted to share that, even though it's old data, I do think it gives us good insights that farmers are using these technologies to learn things that they will implement across many acres in the future. So I promised to talk about generational differences. This is, again, from the KFMA data set, and this is all about the number of farm operators who were born in each of the given generations. So the line on top, which is a little bit over 50% of all farm operators. Oh yeah, I forgot all about this. Thank you for, we're going to do a poll. So I just saw it pop up. It's what generation are you? Were you born? Um, we have five to choose from. The oldest generation is the silent generation, who were born before the end of World War II. The next would be baby boomers, who were born from 1946 to 1964. Generation X, the next one, born between 1965 and 1980. The millennials, 1981 to 1996. And Generation Z, who were born after 1997. And I'd like to get an idea of who the audience is. A lot of times in social media, we'll see some assumptions that millennials are essentially children, but no, in reality, they're old enough to have their own children now. I think the oldest one is bordering right on 40 years old. Gen Z is college age, maybe even out of college by now, the very oldest ones. Most of the group is millennials. 40% were born in millennial, but 30% were baby boomers and Gen X. So that's a pretty good distribution. We have at least one from the silent generation and at least two from Generation Z. So that's encouraging. Now, let's compare those numbers to what we're looking on the graph here. In Kansas, for the last 8 years, the baby boomers have controlled about half the farms, or said another way, the proportion of farm operators in the KFMA data set, about half, a little over half, were born during the baby boomer generation. But that line is gradually decreasing. It's probably less than 50% today in 2020. And it's going to continue to decrease for obvious reasons. The dotted green line, let's see, where's my, I'll close that. The dotted green line here is the silent generation who were born before the end of World War II. That line is decreasing pretty steadily, and in just a matter of a few years, the youngest member of that generation will be in their 80s. So it's gradually fading away. But look at others. The orange line, which is about the same, the silent generation and millennials, both, I'm sorry, the silent generation and Generation X are both about 20% of the proportion of Kansas farm operators. Gen X is increasing slightly trend for the last 10 years. The last couple of years in the data, it's leveled off though. I'm gonna skip millennials for a second, go to Generation Z here in purple. We only have a very few, and it first showed up in 2015. But again, at that time they were right at 20 years old. And today they're leaving college. They're almost mid 20s. But let's look at millennials. In the last 10 years, they went from about less than 10% to over 10% of the farm operators. But it's the fastest growing segment of farm operators in Kansas were born to the millennial generation. A few other things I've noted here is we have several silent generation farmers. They're in 70s, 80 years old, who are operating farms. Their children, who are likely to be older Gen X and younger baby boomers. The baby boomers in that group may be close to retirement age by the time that they receive full control of the farms from the preceding generation. So there's a gerontologist that I'm working with she's at a medical school called the Arkansas Centers for Health Education. Her name is Lavana Trewick, and she reminds me of the aging process. And she's asking questions like, does it make sense for a generation to be skipped when it comes to inheriting the control of the farm? And my immediate reaction would be, well, that's ludicrous. But then she comes back with, well, if the baby boomers are, are at retirement age and their high school classmates have already retired, they may have other plans. Like, well, I haven't thought about it that way. I don't know for sure, but that's something that, the types of questions that she and I are asking when we're looking at some of the studies of aging farm operators. So we know the ages of the farms, and I'm going to add this to the technology adoption at each of the farms. Are there any comments about this before we move on? We could probably spend all day on this graph as well.
No new questions.
So what do we know about millennials and Gen Z? Well, as a Generation X person, I adopted the internet as an adult, right? And so did the rest of the Gen X and baby boomers and the silent generation. Um, when I was in college, I applied for an email address and it was approved and they gave me one. When millennials got to college, they were given an email address whether they wanted it or not. And Gen Z, my children are in high school. The high school gives kids, the students, a email address. And one of the things I've noticed is that my generation, Generation X, and the baby boomers treat email as a formal form of communication. Generation Z do not. They view it as something that they have to be. I'm speaking for my children only, not the whole generation. My kids have to be told to check their email, otherwise, it's not on their radar. Um, and so there are some differences, and I will give the preface too before I offend everybody, is that when we categorize people into these generational groups, we're not saying that everybody follows the trends exactly. And many people may be right at the cusp. If you're 1980 birth date, there may be some tendencies towards baby Generation X as well as to millennial or vice versa. So, but let's take a look at these as ag tech. So these are the same technologies that we talked about before. On the x-axis, we have the four generations. Gen Z, sorry, we don't have a lot of data for you yet. Um, so we're only looking at the silent generation on the far left, the baby boomer next, Generation X, and millennials. Right? And different color bars are the different uh, technologies that we've been talking about. The green bar is automated guidance. We'll come back to that. And the light blue bar is light bar. And a dark blue, which is the first one on the list, will be yield monitors. Looking at these stack of bars, let's call it a distribution. Looking at these distributions, what do we see? There's two groups that are similar, silent generation and millennials, baby boomers and Gen X. These two look similar, and then these two look similar. These are for sole proprietor farms. Okay, I think it's time for the next poll. I want, if you could tell me for the farms that you represent, whether you're on the farm or working um, in conjunction with the farm, are you from a sole proprietorship, one farm operator, or are there multiple operators on the farm? And if it's multiple operators, are you of similar generations, maybe spouses or siblings or cousins who are about the same age? Or is the multiple operator farms across generations? Are the millennials working with baby boomers or Generation X working with silent generation? The next slide will be the same setup, except it'll be for multiple operator farms. And I'll talk about some of the profitability issues that we've observed in Kansas for that. Oh, wow. That's interesting. So we got our responses back. We have about half of the farms in the half of the audience are from farms with multiple operators across generations. So there maybe a millennial working with a baby boomer or a Gen X working with a silent generation. Only 5% or only 7% are multiple operators from the similar generation. So we can, that's been my observation too. Once we have multiple operators, they're usually across generations, except for the partnerships and so forth. 40% of the group are sole proprietors. Okay. That's really interesting. And I think that's going to feed into the next slide really well. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the baby boomers and Generation X seem similar, and millennials and silent generation seem similar. Something struck me when I saw this for the first time, and I'm wondering if you're seeing the same thing. What do we know about millennials and technology? Well, younger people, and this has been the true for hundreds of years, younger people tend to like more technology. And 100 years ago, the technology was maybe mechanized farming, tractors. Younger people tend to like technology better than older people. And in particular, the hypothesis, our assumption is that millennials desire to use technology, but their behavior seems to be more like the silent generation on this graph. And what do we know about the silent generation who were born before the end of World War II? Well, their planning horizon may be shorter, and they may not desire as much technology, but do they have the financial resources to buy it? Well, chances are they do. And they've been making payments on things for longer, and they probably have more financial resources than millennials. And that is sort of my hypothesis, is that millennials desire technology, but if they're farming on their own as a sole proprietor at 30 years old, 35 years old, then they may not have financial resources. What if we have multiple operators? What does that look like? Well, here, it's the same data, except multiple operator farms instead of sole proprietor. Baby boomers jumped up the most. Millennials show up a little bit as well. But silent generation, look at that. Once a silent generation member is on a multiple operator farm, I believe a few things are going on here. One is I'm pretty certain the younger generations are influencing their decision to adopt ag technology, in particular, the data technology such as yield monitors and so forth. And the reason I say that is, well, a couple things. What do we know about multiple operator farms is that, well, if there's, let's say, two family units, then they will probably have more larger acreage to spread out, the fixed cost and get and improve revenue for both families. And technology tends to follow large acreage farms. And also, when it comes to the data technologies like yield monitors and soil sampling, when you have more than one farm operator who's making decisions actively, that data is another form of communication between those farm operators. So, one of the studies that we're looking at is asking the question, you know, does does the millennials and Generation X affect the baby boomer and silent generations decision making process when it comes to technology? Essentially, you have farms that have the desire for technology and the financial resources to invest in it. And when I talk to service providers, and in particular dealers who are selling these technologies, if you're aiming at a millennial on a sole proprietor farm, there may not be your target audience. You may want to look for a farm that has a younger generation and an older generation member on the same farm to target for um, sales and services around agricultural technology.
Terry, we have a question.
Uh-huh.
The graphs seem to show that automation seems to have the biggest bang for the buck. Is that a good
Mhm.
decision for the farmer?
Yes, But let me give you a very counterintuitive answer to that. A lot of these technologies, I'm concerned about returns on investment, profitability, and economics measured in dollars and cents. And if you think back to your Econ 101 class, economists measure economics in more than just dollars and cents. There's another concept called utility, satisfaction. With automated guidance, we can create these spreadsheets and look at what's the value of preventing skips and overlaps, and can we farm more acres in the same amount of time with the same equipment? And the answer is yes, we can. And it's one of the technologies that plays for itself immediately. But let me ask it this way: farmers, this has been another good poll that I should have thought about. Farmers, let's say I want to come to your farm and remove automated guidance from your tractors and combine and sprayers. How much will I have to pay you in order for you to agree to no longer have access to automated guidance? Well, and answer is usually, well, there's no way. I'm not giving that up for anything. And I think that goes to show that automated guidance is one of those technologies that has more to do with the quality of life than it does about economics. And we have several examples of that. So the older generation, the silent generation, automated guidance was one of the few technologies that went against the grain of being adopted across the board by all ages. And one example is, if you think of 75-year-old farmers that might suffer from back and shoulder problems, having automated guidance is something that would allow them to operate farm machinery for a few more years, and that's worth something to them, right? So it's a value that's not necessarily dollars and cents in this case, but the value is in quality of life and improving the utility, the satisfaction level of the farm operator. So, but yeah, the automated guidance does stick out like a sore thumb here. Um, but it's a technology that's it's a no-brainer. Every time we run an analysis, if a farm's got enough acres to support the technology, then yeah, it's a good economic investment. But more often than not, it's also very good to improve the quality of life of the farm operator. You can't say the same thing about yield monitors. A yield monitor doesn't improve a farmer's quality of life. What it does is its job is to provide mounds of data. And for some farms who are ready to make use of that data, it's a very powerful tool to improve profitability. But for farmers who are struggling to address the basic agronomy 101 issues like variety selection and planting on time, well, adding mounds of data won't make their operation better, but it might make it worse off. So the automated technologies have a very different characteristic than the data technologies when it comes to profitability. Yeah,
Harry,
thanks for the
there's
question. Yep, another?
another question. Do you have a graph showing technology adoption by acreage?
I don't have that, but I don't have it with me. As acreage goes up, technology adoption goes up as well. I do need to add that graph, and I apologize for not having it with me today. If you follow me on Twitter, tell you what, I'll tweet that out sometime soon, and if you really want to see what that looks like in Kansas. Any other comments?
Nope, not at this time.
So I promised to show something about profitability on the same farms. This is net farm income broken down by generation for each boomers, millennials, silent generation, and Generation X, as well as multiple generation farms. Okay, the sole proprietor farms broken down by generation and for multiple generation farms. The way we read this, the x-axis is years from 2012 to 2018, the same set of years. The y-axis is net farm income, think of this profitability, deviation from the mean. So 0 would be the mean, the average net farm income profitability. And negative means you're slightly below the average, and positive means you're above average. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're losing money if it's negative $50,000. It just means you're below average. Well, a few things that struck me as interesting. Look at the silent generation. They've been below average the entire time. What does that tell us about the silent generation? I think it's telling us that they're not being as aggressive as younger generations are. They're playing it safe. Wouldn't you? It makes sense to me. The green is millennials. They started off in early 2000s as or 2010s as being below average, but since then they've worked their way up and been average last several years, which is good. Gen X, they're slightly above average the entire time period, and Boomers the same way. They're slightly above average last several years. Multiple generation farms. That's where we're seeing some synergies and higher net farm income. And again, I think that this might be part of it is larger farm sizes could play into this as well. But this was a study that Greg Abendall and I did. We published it last year. It's on agmanager.info, which is also sort of on our slides. This is the Kansas State Farm Management Group, agmanager.info. Um, I'm just looking at the clock. This is in the slides. I'm going to go ahead and speak about it real quickly. We talk about farm data, and one of the issues that farmers come to me with is they're asking questions like, which of these farm data platforms, farm data services should I join? And my immediate reaction is, well, if you don't know for sure, maybe we should just wait until the solution presents itself. You shouldn't feel like you're in a hurry, although you're getting pressure to feel like you are. And we usually have this conversation about, what is farm data? The farmer would like to believe that they own data that comes from their farm. And I work with ag attorneys on this concept quite a bit. We published on this several times, most recently last year in Drake Journal of Agricultural Law. But rather than looking at it as an attorney, I'm going to look at this as an economist, asking, what's the difference between public and private goods? And in this matrix, the way we decide what's public and private is if it's excludable. Can I exclude others from something that I believe is mine? And rival, can I consume it such that no one else can consume the same stuff? Non-rival means multiple people can consume the same service or good without diminishing the value to others. So the way this breaks down is this group here is what we would call pure private goods: pencils, house, food. You can exclude someone else from using your pencil, and once you use it all up, it's gone. No one else can consume it as well. Well, this stuff here is a little bit different. A bridge, you could exclude others. You could put a toll bridge, but it's still non-rival. Sort of like a country club access. And these things are not really private goods either. A fish in the ocean. But a public good would be national defense. Multiple people can consume it. We can't really exclude others from enjoying it. Where does farm data fall in this matrix? And it doesn't fit well really anywhere. It doesn't fit as a pure public good. It doesn't fit as a pure private good. So we're still struggling with this concept of farm data ownership and evaluation of farm data. And that's kind of what I want to talk about for the rest of the morning, is the valuation of farm data. Any comments about that? Or I know that's a little bit confusing and it's sort of an advanced topic to go through, and you may want some time to sit back and digest what this matrix.
There is another question, Terry.
Uh-huh.
What do you believe is the next big improvement in farm technology that will be widely adopted? Have we hit a plateau of farm technology?
So other technology we have in our database we're asking about, we've been asking for 5 years, is turn compensation on planters and sprayers. You know, sprayers, it's almost necessary now. With planters, it's still, we're trying to decide the value. But regardless, most seems like most new technology manufactured products had turn compensation built into it. So we're starting to see more and more of those being in our data set, but we haven't had enough to really evaluate. Partly because commodity prices were low with our most recent data that we acquired. Um, Other than that, I'm going to say I already hinted at it. I'm going to say automation, but not on the guidance and boom control, but more on farm data. Now we're automating the process of pushing data to the cloud through telematics. You know, your equipment is doing this with engine diagnostics already. Um, I think the next wave will be more automation, but on the data analysis, data management, such that recommendations will show up on your variable rate controllers with fewer and fewer hands or humans on that data. Sydney, are we going to 11:30 or for you? You're at 12:30, right? So
Yeah, we need to leave a few minutes for housekeeping
okay,
items.
I'll quickly show why I wanted to speak about with cooperative games when it comes to farm data. So farmers, your optimal choices are not only a function of what you should do, but what your cohort, your neighboring farmers do, as well as retailers that you're working with, crop consultants and manufacturers. Okay. So this is a fun game I'm going to leave you with. It's called a cooperative game from game theory. In particular, this is the prisoner's dilemma. The premise is in a typical year, we would be in Ocean City, Maryland for the Mid Atlantic Crop Management Conference. And you go out and have a good time and you wind up in jail. Okay. You and your best friend. So the the police give you an option. You can remain silent or confess, and your best friend has the same option, but they're in a different room and they won't let you see them. Their options are to remain silent and confess. If you both remain silent, you both go to jail for 1 year. If you remain silent and your best friend confesses, you go to jail for 3 years and your best friend doesn't get any time. If you confess and your best friend remains silent, you go to jail for 0 years. You get to walk away, and your ex best friend goes to jail for 3 years. If you both confess, you both go to jail for 2 years. Pop quiz. What do you do? And answer is, well, doesn't matter so much what you would do. What you really need to know is what. You want to know what your best friend was going to do. This is a cooperative game. And this is a premise in economics called game theory. There was a movie came out 20 something years ago called A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe about the person who came up with this concept and made a movie about it. It's a good movie. I encourage you to watch it. Using game theory and not just one game, but a bunch of games in a row. It's called evolutionary game theory. And not only with two parties, but multiple parties, farmers uh, versus their cohort, also with ag retailers, crop consultants, farm data companies, the public sector, government. In the evolutionary game theory context, I think this is what the results will look like. Today, we have a bunch of data platforms who are trying to get farm data on the y axis, time on the x. The blue is the number of data platforms. The green is the number of farmers. This is the way I think it's going to play out. I think once we get a very few data platforms trying to get farm data, farmers will start to see that there is a good decision to be made and they'll jump on it. And up until then, they'll just sit back and wait, which I think is the optimal strategy in most cases. This is the way I view the farm data industry moving forward. Um, so, sum up a few things. Farmers, you should not feel like you're in a hurry to join farm data services. Do not let the fear of missing out influence your decision-making process. Ag tech is not for everybody. There's a big if of who does the farmer crop consultant that we're talking about have, are they willing to devote the human capital to make these data technologies work? And if not, then that might not be optimal for that farm. Sometimes waiting is the best strategy. And we do expect Generation Z to operate farms very differently than baby boomers. I encourage you to have conversations that are open. Baby boomers, you've seen the silent generation have tremendous loyalty, not only to a person, but also to a service provider, a retail location. Ask Generation Z how they make their decisions. So some of the future work I'm going to do along these lines are I'm asking, is precision ag profitable, or do farmers who make more money invest in precision ag? Now I'm seeing a lot more evidence to the second. Now looking at ag tech generations across ag tech adoption across generations, and I'm shared most of that today. And again, here's my contact information. I welcome any comments and feedback now or through email or Twitter, either way, and hope to continue the conversation.
Terry, looks like there's one last question. Have you looked into any correlations between different types of crops grown and a willingness to adopt different technologies across the generations?
So as far as crops, no, USDA reports that with their ARM survey because they focus on a crop. But the Kansas data I have, there's no such thing as a farm that only has corn. If they have corn, they're going to have soybean. And also don't forget that Kansas is number one grain, sorghum, and wheat producing state too. So most of our farms will have at least 3 of those 4. And we also have cotton too in Kansas. So it's really hard to break down by crop, I guess. But when I do make my correlations, I usually use corn price per bushel from corn, although it's somewhat correlated to the other crops as well. What was the second half of that question?
Sure. Let's see. Have you looked into any correlations between different types of crops grown and a willingness to adopt different technologies across the generations?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at a willingness to adopt study. These are the studies we're looking at are farmers who are part of the farm records program, and they've reported to us what technologies that they have. We haven't asked them why they adopted or at what break-even prices that they'd be willing to pay in order to adopt. So it's not a true willingness to pay study. That's a good idea, though. I like to do that.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. We certainly appreciate your time today. As we wrap up on their first day of virtual crop school, I just want to let everyone know that we're aware of some problems with the first 2 quizzes, and we will be addressing those as soon as humanly possible.